My name is Amara, daughter of Clem the cloth merchant, and I was 19 years old when they stole my life. Before the white men came with their chains and guns, I lived in a prosperous trading village on the coast where the great river meets the endless water. My father sold beautiful kente cloth to Europeans who came seeking ivory and gold, and my mother was known throughout our region as a healer whose knowledge of plants and medicines could cure ailments that baffled even the white doctors. I was my parents' only surviving child, educated in the languages of trade, English, Portuguese, and Arabic, as well as the wisdom of my people. My father believed that knowledge was the greatest protection against a dangerous world, so he taught me to read and write in multiple scripts, calculate profits and losses, to negotiate with foreign merchants who thought African women were incapable of intelligent discourse. Amara, he would say as we sat in our compound watching the trading ships arrive from distant shores, the world is changing. Our people must be prepared to meet it with wisdom and strength. I thought I was prepared. I thought my education, my family's status, my understanding of the white man's language would protect me from the fate that befell so many others. I was wrong. The slavers came at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the river and most of our village was just waking. They moved with the efficiency of predators who had perfected their hunt, surrounding our compound before anyone could. Sound an alarm. I remember the sound of splintering wood as they broke down our door, the screams of my mother as they dragged my father from his bed, the terrible silence that followed the crack of musket fire. They killed my parents because they resisted. They killed our servants because they were witnesses. They took me because I was young and strong and would fetch a good price in the markets. Across the water down the march to the coast took 5 days. Chained to a dozen of other captives, some from my village, but many from places I had never heard of, speaking languages I couldn't understand. We were given barely enough water to keep us alive, fed scraps that wouldn't be offered to animals. Those who fell from exhaustion were left for the vultures' dot by the time we reached the slave fort on the coast. I had learned the first terrible lesson of my captivity. I was no longer Amara, daughter of Quaim, educated young woman with a bright future. I was cargo, valuable only for my potential labor and the profit my body could generate for men who saw me as less than human. The fort was a massive stone structure built by the Portuguese, its walls thick enough to muffle the cries of the hundreds of people crammed into its dungeons. They separated us by gender and age, pushing the women and girls into a chamber so crowded we could barely sit. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sweet, sick scent of infection and despair. I was shoved into a corner where I huddled against the cold stone wall, trying to make sense of what had happened to my ordered world. Around me, women wept for lost children. Mothers called out names of sons and daughters who might be locked in chambers, just yards away, but might as well have been on the moon. You speak the white man's language. The voice came from an older woman pressed against me in the darkness. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed familiar, though I was certain we had never met. Yes, I whispered back in English, then switched to our shared local dialect. I learned it from my father for trading. Good. Then you understand what they say about us, what they plan for us? I nodded, though understanding made everything worse. I had heard the Portuguese traders discussing us like livestock, calculating how many bodies could be packed into a ship's hold, debating whether the profit from cramming in extra people outweighed the loss from higher mortality rates. I am Essie, the woman said. I was taken from my village 3 months ago. I have seen 4 ships leave this place, all bound for the lands across the water. Soon it will be our turn. What happens then? I asked, though I feared I already knew. Then, we discover whether we're strong enough to survive the crossing and what awaits us on the other side. We waited in that dungeon for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of barely edible food, contaminated water, and the constant sound of suffering echoing off stone walls. 6 weeks of watching women weaken and sicken, of holding dying strangers in my arms because no one should die alone. 6 weeks of learning that human beings could inflict unimaginable cruelty on other human beings and sleep soundly afterward. I also learned something else during those weeks. I learned that the human spirit is stronger than stone walls and iron chains. I learned it from Essie, who had survived 3 months of captivity without losing her dignity or her hope. I learned it from a young mother named Akasua, who sang lullabies to her baby even as her own body wasted away from insufficient food. I learned it from an elderly woman called Grandmother, who shared stories of our ancestors, reminding us that we were the daughters of kings and queens, warriors and wise women who had never bowed to anyone. They can chain our bodies, Grandmother whispered on the nights when despair threatened to overwhelm us. But they cannot chain our souls unless we let them. The morning they came to take us to the ship, I carried Grandmother's words in my heart. Like armor, the sun was just rising over the Atlantic, painting the water gold and red, beautiful enough to break your heart if you didn't know it was the last glimpse of home you would ever see. The ship waiting at the harbor was smaller than I had expected, but larger than any vessel I had ever seen up close. The Prosperity was painted on its side in letters I could read, and flying above, it was the flag of England. Men with sun-weathered faces and clothes that spoke of long months at sea moved about its deck with practiced efficiency, preparing. For the human cargo, they were about to load Dot as we were herded toward the gangplank. I caught sight of a young white man standing near the ship's railing. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with brown hair bleached by salt and sun, and eyes that seemed different from the other sailors, troubled rather than callous, pained rather than indifferent. When his gaze met mine for just a moment, I saw something in his expression that I hadn't seen in any white face since my capture, recognition of my humanity. Then we were being pushed down into the ship's hold, and the nightmare of the middle passage began. The hold was divided into compartments, barely tall enough for a person to sit upright. We were chained in rows, pressed so closely together that movement was nearly impossible. The air was thick and foul, heavy with the smell of tar and timber and human suffering. Above us, we could hear the sounds of the crew preparing to leave. Port shouted orders, running footsteps, the creak and groan of rigging being adjusted. This is where we learn what we are made of, Essie whispered beside me as the ship began to move and our world tilted sickeningly with the motion of the waves. I closed my eyes and tried to remember my father's face, my mother's voice, the feeling of morning sunlight on the river where I used to bathe. I tried to hold on to the woman I had been before this horror began, even as everything around me seemed designed to strip away every trace of my former self. But in the darkness of that hold, chained between two strangers whose names I didn't know, feeling the ship carry me away from everything I had ever loved, I made a silent vow. They could take my freedom, they could steal my future, they could treat my body like cargo, but they could not take away who I was inside. I was still Amara, daughter of Quaim, carrier of my people's wisdom and strength, and somehow, some way, I would survive this crossing and find a way to honor the memory of everyone who didn't dot as the Prosperity sailed into the open Atlantic. Carrying its human cargo toward an unknown destination, I began the longest and most terrible journey of my life. But I began it as myself, and I was determined to end it the same way. The young man with the troubled eyes would, I later learned, play a part in that determination. But in those first dark hours below deck, all I knew was that I had to find the strength to endure whatever came next on my survival. I would discover depended not just on my own will, but on unexpected allies and acts of mercy in the most merciless of circumstances. The Prosperity had been at sea for 6 days. When I first spoke to Thomas Whitmore, I knew his name because I had heard the crew addressing him as young Master Thomas and Captain's son, and I had pieced together from overheard conversations that he was being groomed to take over his father's shipping business. What I didn't know was why he looked so haunted every time he descended into the hold to check on the human cargo dog. Captain Samuel Whitmore was a man carved from granite and cruelty, with gray eyes that seemed to see people only in terms of their profit potential. He walked through the hold during his daily inspections with the same expression he might wear when examining bales of cotton or barrels of rum, calculating value, assessing condition, tallying potential losses. His son accompanied him on these visits, but where the captain saw merchandise, Thomas saw suffering human beings. I noticed the difference in their reactions immediately. Captain Whitmore would step over sick passengers without a second glance, bark orders about cleaning up damaged goods, and discuss mortality rates with the same detachment other men might use to discuss the weather. Thomas, however, lingered near people who were obviously ill, asked quiet questions about sanitation and medical care, and looked physically pained when his father spoke of us as cargo rather than people. The difference between father and son became most apparent during the outbreak of dysentery that began in our second week at sea. The disease spread quickly through the hold, where we were packed so tightly that contagion was inevitable. People began dying faster than the crew could remove the bodies, and the stench became so overwhelming that even the hardened sailors complained. "We're going to lose half the cargo if this continues," Captain Whitmore announced during one of his inspections, his voice echoing off the ship's wooden ribs. "Double the lime, reduce the water rations, and separate the sick ones. Can't have them contaminating the healthy stock." "Father," Thomas said quietly, "perhaps if we brought them on deck in smaller groups for fresh air, improve the ventilation." "Fresh air doesn't pay for this voyage, boy," the captain snapped. "These people are merchandise, not passengers. They get fed enough to stay alive and nothing more." But I noticed that after his father left, Thomas remained behind. He moved through the hold with the ship's surgeon, checking on the sickest passengers and quietly ordering extra rations of clean water for those who seemed most likely to survive with help. It was during one of these clandestine mercy missions that our eyes met again. I was helping care for a young woman named Kessie who was burning with fever, using techniques my mother had taught me for breaking dangerous temperatures. Thomas approached our section and knelt down beside us, his face grave with concern. "How is she?" he asked, and I realized with shock that he was addressing me directly, as if my answer mattered. "The fever is very high," I replied in English, watching his eyes widen with surprise at my fluency. "Without medicine to bring it down, she may not survive the night." Thomas stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling with the realization that I was not only capable of intelligent conversation, but possessed medical knowledge he might need. "You speak English," he said unnecessarily. "I speak several languages," I replied with quiet dignity. My father was a merchant who believed education was important for his daughter. "Your father," Thomas began, then stopped, perhaps realizing that asking about my family would require acknowledging that I had been stolen from a life that mattered to people who loved me. "My father is dead," I said simply, "killed by the men who brought me to your ship. My mother as well." The pain that crossed Thomas's face was genuine and immediate. "I'm sorry," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "Are you?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Sorry enough to help this girl who is dying. Sorry enough to bring clean water and medicine instead of apologies." Thomas looked around quickly to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. What kind of medicine does she need? Willow bark tea to break the fever, if you have it. Clean cloths soaked in cool water. Broth instead of the scraps we've been getting. I paused, then added, and space to breathe. The air down here is poison. I can't bring her on deck, Thomas said. My father would. I'm not asking you to defy your father, I interrupted. I'm asking you to decide whether this girl's life has any value to you, whether any of our lives do. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at Kessa's fevered face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. They do. Your lives, they matter. But I don't know how to help without making things worse. For everyone, then learn, I said firmly. Ask questions. Pay attention. Use the education your father gave you to see us as human beings instead of cargo. That night, Thomas returned with willow bark tea and clean rags. He also brought something. I hadn't expected respect. He asked my name, listened when I explained my mother's healing techniques, and followed my instructions for caring for Kessie without question or condescension. I'm Thomas, he said as we worked together to bring down the girl's fever. And I don't know how to apologize for what we're doing to you, what my family's business is built on. Don't apologize, I said, wringing out a cool cloth to place on Kessie's forehead. Apologizing is easy. Changing is hard. How do I change something this big? This system that my father, my grandfather, my whole family has been part of? I looked at this young man who seemed genuinely tormented by his circumstances, who was risking his father's anger to bring medicine to dying strangers. And I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Hope. You start small, I said. You save one life at a time. You treat people as human beings instead of property. You use whatever power you have to reduce suffering instead of increasing profit. And if my father finds out, then you decide what matters more, his approval or your soul. Thomas was quiet for a long time after that, but he continued visiting the hold each night, bringing what medical supplies he could steal from the ship's stores and learning from me and other women who had knowledge of healing. Slowly, quietly, he began making small changes that reduced the mortality rate and improved conditions just enough to keep more people alive. He also began asking me about my life before the ship, about my family and my village and the world he had helped destroy. I told him about my father's business, about the beautiful cloth my people wove, about the complex trading relationships that had existed along our coast for centuries before the slave ships arrived. I never thought about where you came from, Thomas admitted one night as we sat in the cramped space between the cargo holds, speaking in whispers while the rest of the ship slept. To me, to all of us, you were just there, available for purchase. I never considered that you had families, educations, lives that mattered. And now, I asked, now I can't stop thinking about it, about all the people whose lives we've destroyed, all the families we've separated, all the futures we've stolen. He looked at me with eyes full of pain and confusion. How do I live with that knowledge? The same way I live with what was done to me, I said. You find a way to honor the people who've been hurt. You find a way to make sure their suffering has meaning. How do I do that? I don't know yet, I admitted. But I think the answer starts with seeing us as people worth saving rather than cargo worth preserving. As the weeks passed and the prosperity sailed deeper into the Atlantic, Thomas and I continued our nighttime conversations. He told me about growing up on ships, about the expectations his father had for him, about his growing certainty that he couldn't live the life that had been planned for him. I told him about my dreams of teaching, about my mother's healing knowledge, about my determination to survive this crossing and find a way to help others do the same. Slowly, carefully, a friendship began to grow between us, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the recognition that we were both trapped in a system that dehumanized everyone it touched. Captor and captive alike. Neither of us knew where this friendship would lead, but I began to believe that Thomas might be the key to survival, not just for me, but for many of the people suffering in the hold below. His growing conscience and my knowledge of medicine and languages created possibilities that neither of us could have imagined alone. The voyage was far from over, and the worst hardships still lay ahead. But for the first time since my capture, I had an ally among my captors, someone who saw me as a person worth saving rather than property worth preserving. It was a dangerous alliance, but it was also the beginning of hope. The crisis that would test everything Thomas and I had built between us came in our 5th week at sea, during a storm that lasted 3 days and nearly destroyed the Prosperity. The ship groaned and pitched in waves higher than houses, and down in the hold, we were thrown against each other and the ship's walls with bone-breaking force. Several people died from injuries sustained during those terrible days, and many more were left hurt and broken. But it was what happened after the storm that truly changed everything. When the weather finally calmed and the crew began assessing damage, they discovered that the ship's freshwater stores had been contaminated by seawater during the worst of the pounding. Captain Whitmore called a meeting of his officers to discuss rationing, and Thomas overheard the conversation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We've got maybe 10 days of clean water left if we're careful," the first mate reported. "Enough for the crew and a few of the stronger cargo, but not enough for everyone." "A simple solution," Captain Whitmore said with his characteristic coldness. "We dump the sick ones, the weak ones, anyone who probably won't survive the crossing anyway. Reduce the passenger count, extend the water supply." "How many are we talking about, Captain?" Another officer asked. "Maybe 30, 40 people. The investment loss hurts, but it's better than losing the whole cargo to dehydration." Thomas told me about this conversation later that night, his voice shaking with horror and rage. "They're planning to throw sick people overboard like garbage," he said. "People who could recover with proper care, families with children. They're going to murder them to save water for the rest." "When?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Tomorrow morning. They've already selected the people they consider expendable." I closed my eyes, thinking of Kessie, who had recovered from her fever but was still weak, of an elderly man named Kofi who had taught me songs from his village, of a young mother whose baby had died in the storm but who was still alive herself, still deserving of the chance to survive. "Thomas," I said carefully, "you have a choice to make. I know." His voice was barely audible. "I've been thinking about it all day." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if I don't stop this, I become as guilty as my father. I'm thinking that some things are more important than family loyalty or business profits." He looked at me with eyes that seemed to have aged years in a single day. "I'm thinking that I'd rather die standing up for what's right than live as someone who let innocent people be murdered. What can you do?" "I can warn people, help them hide, create confusion that makes it harder for my father to carry out his plan." Thomas paused, then added, "And I can make sure there's enough water for everyone. By taking less for the crew, your father will know you're working against him." "Yes, he will." And then Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Then I face whatever consequences come. But Amara, I can't watch 30 people be thrown into the ocean and do nothing. I can't live with that on my conscience." "Then don't," I said simply. "Help us save them." What followed was the most dangerous night of my captivity. Thomas moved through the ship like a ghost, quietly warning people who had been marked for death, helping them switch places with healthier prisoners, creating confusion in the ship's records that would make it harder for his father to identify his targets. I used my knowledge of several African languages to spread word through the hold, organizing a system where the strongest people surrounded and protected the weakest. making it nearly impossible for the crew to single out individuals without causing a general uprising. But our most important work was redistributing the water supplies. Thomas had discovered that his father was hoarding extra rations for the officers and crew, far more than necessary for survival. Working together, we secretly moved portions of this excess to the hold, ensuring that everyone had enough water to survive the remaining voyage. Captain Whitmore noticed the discrepancies the next morning when he came to select his victims. But instead of finding weak, isolated people easy to remove, he found a cargo hold organized in ways that made his plan impossible to execute quietly. "What the hell is this?" he roared when he saw the new arrangements. "Why are they grouped like this? Who's been interfering with my cargo?" The ship's officers looked around nervously, clearly as confused as their captain. But Captain Whitmore's eyes went immediately to his son, who was standing near the back of the group with an expression of barely controlled defiance. "Thomas," the captain said, his voice dangerously quiet, "do you know anything about this?" "I know that murdering sick people to save water is wrong," Thomas replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hold. "I know that these people are human beings, not cargo. And I know that what you're planning is evil." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the hold, crew and captive alike, seemed to stop breathing as father and son faced each other across a moral chasm that could never be bridged. "You've betrayed your own family," Captain Whitmore said finally. "Your own blood, your own future, for the sake of strangers who would slit your throat given the chance." "No," Thomas said firmly. "I've chosen to be the kind of man I can live with being, the kind of man who doesn't murder innocent people for profit." Captain Whitmore's face went white with rage. "You're no son of mine," he snarled. "And when we reach Charleston, you'll discover what happens to mutineers on my ship." But Thomas had already made his choice, and there was no going back. For the rest of the voyage, he was treated as a prisoner rather than crew, confined to quarters, except when he was needed for essential ship's duties. But the damage to his father's plan had already been done. The people marked for death remained alive, the water was more fairly distributed, and the mortality rate in the hold dropped dramatically. The crew, meanwhile, was deeply divided by what had happened. Some supported the captain's brutal pragmatism, but others were shaken by Thomas's courage and began questioning their own participation in the slave trade. The ship became a pressure cooker of moral conflict, with everyone forced to choose sides in a battle between profit and conscience. For me, Thomas's stand was both inspiring and terrifying. I was grateful beyond words that he had risked everything to save lives, but I was also afraid of what his father might do to him once we reached port. And I was beginning to understand that Thomas and I were bound together now in ways that would be difficult to escape. "Why did you do it?" I asked him during one of our brief conversations in the weeks that followed. "You could have looked the other way, kept your father's approval, inherited his business. Why throw all of that away for people you barely know?" "Because of you," he said simply. "Because you taught me to see you as human beings instead of cargo. Because once you really see people as people, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to treating them as property." "And what happens when we reach Charleston? What happens to your future?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean that surrounded us. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I can't go back to being the person I was before I met you. I can't go back to a life built on other people's suffering. Then what will you do?" "I'll find a way to help more people, to make amends for the damage my family has done, to use whatever privileges I have to fight against this system instead of profiting from it." As the Prosperity sailed toward the American coast, carrying its cargo of stolen lives toward an uncertain future, I realized that Thomas had become something I never expected to find on a slave ship. a genuine ally in the fight for human dignity. His transformation from passive observer to active resistor gave me hope that change was possible, even in the darkest circumstances, but I also knew that our real test was still ahead. Charleston would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new choices that would determine whether the bond we had forged in the ship's hold could survive in the harsh realities of slave society. Thomas had proven himself willing to sacrifice everything for the principle that human life had value regardless of race or status. Now we would discover whether that principle could survive the pressures of family, society, and economic reality. For both of us, the voyage was ending, but the real journey was just beginning. The harbor at Charleston appeared on the horizon, like a promise and a threat combined. After 7 weeks at sea, the sight of land should have brought relief. But for those of us chained in the hold, it marked the beginning of a new kind of nightmare. We were about to be sold like cattle, separated from the friends we had made during the voyage, scattered to plantations throughout the South, where we would disappear into the vast machinery of slave labor. But as the prosperity approached the dock, I carried with me something I hadn't possessed when the voyage began. The knowledge that at least one white person saw me as fully human, and the hope that this recognition might somehow be used to help others. Captain Whitmore had made his intentions clear regarding his son's future. Thomas would be disowned, cut off from family wealth, and abandoned in Charleston with nothing but the clothes on his back. The captain spoke of it as a fitting punishment for betrayal, but I could see in Thomas's eyes that he viewed it as liberation. "I've been thinking," Thomas said to me during our final conversation before we docked. We were speaking through the bars that separated the cargo hold from the ship's lower deck, our voices barely audible above the sounds of the crew preparing for arrival. "About what happens next. What do you mean?" "I mean, I can't just walk away and leave you to whatever fate awaits. I can't pretend that what we've shared, what you've taught me, doesn't matter." His hands gripped the bars between us, and I could see the determination in his eyes. "I want to help. I need to help. Thomas, you're about to lose everything because of choices you made to help people like me. You don't owe us anything more." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "I owe you my conscience. I owe you the chance to live as the remarkable woman you are instead of as someone's property. And I owe it to myself to become the kind of man who fights against injustice instead of profiting from it." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I have some money saved, enough to buy perhaps 1 or 2 people at the slave market. I'm saying that I know people in Charleston who might help, people who disagree with slavery but are afraid to act. I'm saying that maybe, if we're very careful and very lucky, we can find a way to keep you from disappearing into the plantation system." The hope that flared in my chest was almost painful in its intensity. "You would do that? Risk what little you have left to help me? Amara, you saved my soul during this voyage. You showed me who I really wanted to be. Helping you isn't a risk. It's the first step toward the life I want to build. And if we're caught, if your plan fails, then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll know I used my freedom to fight for someone else's." The slave auction in Charleston was everything I had been told to expect, and worse than I could have imagined. We were inspected like livestock, our teeth examined, our muscles prodded, our bodies exposed and evaluated by men who saw us investments rather than people. I stood on the auction block fighting to maintain my dignity while strangers bid on my future, trying to remember grandmother's words about keeping my soul free, even when my body was chained taut. But in the crowd of potential buyers, I spotted Thomas. He looked different, dressed in ordinary clothes rather than ship's attire, but his eyes found mine across the chaos of the market, and I saw in them the same determination that had driven him to defy his father. The bidding for me was competitive. My youth, my health, and my obvious intelligence made me valuable to plantation owners looking for house servants who could be trusted with complex responsibilities. The price climbed higher than Thomas could afford, and I watched his face grow. Desperate as he realized his plan was failing, then something unexpected happened. A well-dressed woman in her 50s approached Thomas and spoke quietly in his ear. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw her nod toward me. Saw Thomas's expression change from despair to cautious hope. When the bidding ended, I had been purchased not by a plantation owner, but by Mrs. Eleanor Hendricks, a Charleston widow who ran a small household with her adult daughter. As I was led away from the auction block, I caught sight of Thomas following at a discreet distance, and I began to understand that whatever arrangement had been made, he was part of it. Mrs. Hendricks' home was unlike any place I had been since. My capture. The house was modest but comfortable, the work was manageable, and most importantly, Mrs. Hendricks and her daughter Sarah treated their servants with a respect that bordered on kindness. I was given my own small room, adequate food, and responsibilities that made use of my education rather than ignoring it, but the real surprise came 3 days after my arrival, when Mrs. Hendricks called me into her parlor for what she described as a private conversation. "Amara," she said, gesturing for me to sit in a chair across from her, the first time since my capture that I had been invited to sit in the presence of a white person. "I want you to understand your situation here." "Yes, ma'am." "Young Thomas." Whitmore came to me with a rather unusual request. He told me about your voyage, about your education and your character, and about his awakening to the realities of slavery. He asked me to purchase you not as a permanent servant, but as a temporary arrangement while he works to secure your freedom. I stared at her, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. My freedom? Thomas is working with a group of people here in Charleston who oppose slavery, people who help enslaved individuals escape to the North or purchase their freedom legally. It's dangerous work and it takes time, but Thomas is committed to ensuring that you don't spend the rest of your life in bondage. Why would you help with such a thing? I asked. Why would you risk your reputation and safety for a stranger? Mrs. Hendricks smiled sadly. Because my late husband and I always opposed slavery, even though we lived surrounded by it. We lacked the courage to act on our convictions, but when Thomas came to us with a specific plan to help a specific person, we realized this was our chance to do what we should have done years ago. And in the meantime, you work for me as a paid servant rather than enslaved property. You help me with correspondence, accounting, and household management. You use your education and intelligence for purposes that matter. And you help us identify other people who might be helped by our network. The arrangement was almost too good to believe. Instead of picking cotton or cleaning a plantation house, I found myself managing Mrs. Hendricks' business correspondence, tutoring her daughter in French, and helping coordinate the activities of Charleston's small but determined abolition movement. Thomas visited regularly, ostensibly to discuss business matters, but actually to check on my welfare and report on progress toward securing my legal freedom. During these visits, we continued the conversations that had begun in the ship's hold, but now they were tinged with hope rather than despair. I found work with a shipping company that refuses to transport enslaved people, he told me during one of these visits. The pay is low and the work is hard, but I can sleep at night knowing I'm not profiting from human suffering. And your father has disowned me completely, as promised. But Amara, I've never felt freer in my life. Every day I wake up knowing that I'm using my time and energy to fight against injustice rather than perpetuate it. Do you ever regret what you gave up? Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I regret that it took me so long to understand what was right. I regret all the voyages I participated in before I met you. all the people I helped enslave through my ignorance and passivity. But I don't regret choosing conscience over comfort. I don't regret choosing to see you as a person rather than property. 6 months after my arrival in Charleston, Thomas brought news that changed everything. He had secured enough money to purchase my freedom papers legally. A combination of his savings, donations from sympathetic abolitionists, and Mrs. Hendricks' contribution had made it possible for me to become a free woman under South Carolina law. "It's not enough," he said as we stood in Mrs. Hendricks' garden holding the papers that made me legally free. "It's not justice for what was done to you, not compensation for your losses, not restoration of the life that was stolen. But it's a beginning. It's everything," I said, tears streaming down my face as I looked at the documents that meant I could never again be bought or sold. "Thomas, you've given me back my life." "No," he said gently. "I've simply removed the legal barriers that were keeping you from the life you were always meant to live. Everything else, your strength, your intelligence, your determination to survive and help others, that was always yours. As a free woman, I chose to stay in Charleston and continue the work we had begun. Mrs. Hendricks offered me a permanent position managing her household and helping coordinate the underground network that assisted enslaved people seeking freedom. It was dangerous work. Helping people escape was illegal and could result in imprisonment or worse, but it was also meaningful in ways that my previous life as a merchant's daughter had never been. Thomas and I became partners in this work, using his connections in the shipping industry and my knowledge of multiple languages to help people find passage to the North. We developed a system where Thomas would identify sympathetic ship captains willing to transport escaped slaves, while I would help prepare people for the journey and provide them with the skills they would need to survive as free people in unfamiliar places. But our partnership was becoming something more than professional collaboration. Over the months of working together, the respect and friendship that had developed during our voyage had deepened into something that neither of us had expected or planned. "Amara," Thomas said one evening as we walked along Charleston's harbor, watching the ships that had once carried human cargo now carrying legitimate trade goods, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I've been offered a position with an anti-slavery organization in Philadelphia. Good pay, important work, a chance to fight the slave trade on a larger scale." He paused, then added, "But it would mean leaving Charleston, leaving this work, leaving you." The thought of Thomas leaving sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening breeze coming off the water. "It sounds like an important opportunity," I said carefully. "It is. But Amara, somewhere along the way, you've become more important to me than any opportunity. What started as respect and friendship has become something deeper, something I never expected to feel for anyone." I stopped walking and turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same confusing mixture of love and uncertainty that I had been feeling for weeks. "Thomas, you know how complicated this is. The danger of a relationship between us, the legal implications, the social consequences. I know all of that," he interrupted gently. "But I also know that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, that working with you has given my life meaning and purpose, and that the thought of building a future without you feels impossible. And what kind of future could we have? Here in the South, such a relationship would put both our lives at risk. Even in the North, we would face hostility and legal barriers. Then we face them together," Thomas said simply. "Amara, I gave up everything I thought I wanted when I chose to help you on that ship. But what I discovered was that what I thought I wanted wasn't worth having. What I want now is a life of purpose, a life fighting for justice, a life shared with someone who makes me want to be better than I am." I looked at this man who had risked everything to save strangers, who had given up wealth and family approval to follow his conscience, who had worked tirelessly to secure my freedom while asking nothing in return. The love I felt for him was complicated by our history, by the circumstances that had brought us together, by the power imbalances that had initially defined our relationship. But it was also pure and strong and built on mutual respect and shared values. If we do this, I said slowly, if we choose to build a life together, it has to be as equals. Not as grateful former slave and benevolent white savior, but as two people who see each other clearly and choose each other freely. That's exactly what I want, Thomas said. That's what you've always been to me. An equal, a partner, someone whose opinions and dreams matter as much as my own. Then yes, I said, my heart racing with a mixture of joy and terror. Yes to Philadelphia. Yes to building something new together. Yes to facing whatever comes as partners rather than alone. We were married quietly in Philadelphia 3 months later, witnessed by fellow abolitionists who had become our chosen family. It was a small ceremony, but it felt more meaningful than any grand social event could have been. We were choosing each other not because society approved or because our union served any purpose other than our mutual love and commitment. Our life in Philadelphia was not easy, but it was fulfilling in ways I had never imagined possible. Thomas worked for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, using his knowledge of shipping and trade to disrupt slave trafficking and help escaped slaves find safety. I established a school for freed slaves and their children, teaching literacy and practical skills that would help them build independent lives. We faced hostility and prejudice, certainly. There were places we couldn't go together, people who refused to serve us, moments when the weight of society's disapproval felt crushing. But we also found unexpected allies and communities of people who judged us by our character rather than our unconventional marriage. Do you ever regret it? I asked Thomas one evening as we sat in our small home, reviewing the accounts for my school. Giving up the life you were born to for this one? Thomas looked around our modest parlor, filled with books, letters from people we had helped, photographs of students from my school, and smiled. Regret trading a life built on other people's suffering for one dedicated to reducing that suffering? Regret exchanging inherited wealth for earned purpose? Regret choosing love over social approval? When you put it that way, Amara, the man I was before I met you, wasn't really living. He was just going through the motions, following a path, laid out by other people, never questioning whether that path was right or wrong. You didn't just save individual lives during that voyage, you saved my soul. And you, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand, gave me back my freedom and then helped me use it for something meaningful. You could have simply purchased my freedom and walked away, satisfied that you had done your good deed. Instead, you chose to build a life dedicated to ensuring that other people wouldn't have to endure what I endured. As I write this 5 years after our marriage, our school has helped more than 200 former slaves learn to read and write. Thomas's work with the Anti-Slavery Society has disrupted dozens of slave ships and helped hundreds of people reach freedom in the North. We've built a life that neither of us could have imagined when we first met in the hold of a slave ship. Our love story began in the darkest circumstances imaginable, with me chained in a ship's hold and Thomas complicit in the system that had stolen my freedom. But it became something beautiful and powerful precisely because we had to choose each other. Over everything else, our respective societies offered us. I often think about the other women who were locked in that hold with me, about Essie and Kessie and all the others whose stories ended differently than mine. I think about the randomness that brought Thomas and me together, the circumstances that allowed him to see my humanity when so many others could not. But I also think about the choices we both made. My choice to maintain my dignity and humanity despite dehumanizing circumstances. Thomas's choice to risk everything for moral principle, our mutual choice to build a relationship based on equality and shared purpose rather than the power dynamics that had initially defined our interaction. The blanket Thomas brought me that first dawn on the ship was a simple act of mercy, but mercy, I have learned, can be the beginning of transformation. One small act of seeing another person's humanity can lead to a complete re-examination of one's values and priorities. One moment of choosing compassion over compliance can change the trajectory of multiple lives. Thomas and I didn't just fall in love despite the circumstances that brought us together. We fell in love because those circumstances revealed who we really were underneath the roles society had assigned us. In the cramped, dark hold of a slave ship, we discovered that love and dignity and moral courage could flourish even in the most impossible conditions. Our story is one of many from that terrible period in history, but it's also proof that individual choices matter, that love can transcend the most rigid social barriers, and that redemption is possible even for those who begin on the wrong side of justice. The girl who was locked below deck in a slave ship's hold became a teacher, an abolitionist, and a free woman who chose her own destiny. The captain's son who brought her a blanket became a man who dedicated his life to fighting the system that had once enriched his family. Together, we became partners in the most important work either of us ever did, the work of recognizing and defending human dignity in all its forms, regardless of race or status or circumstances of birth. And it all began with one simple act of mercy in the darkness before dawn.